Well, if you would, open up to Nehemiah chapter 4. We're going to continue through the book as we've done here. And I got to listen to last week's Joel Bratcher's sermon. I love Joel, and he set up the first part of chapter 4 great. But I don't know about you, but life has not been the smoothest journey for me. I don't know if life has just, every time you look back on kind of the story of your life and your journey, that it's been this smooth like process, step after step. For me, my life, I found oftentimes that I make these plans that I set out to make, and then I start living in those plans only to find those plans not work out as I thought they were going to. Is anyone else like that with me? That maybe life has been like that a little bit for you. And what's interesting is that we find Nehemiah in this section, in chapter 4, verses 15 through 23, that he is just on the other side of a moment like that. He's just on the other side of his plans not really working out as he thought they were going to. Like you look at chapters 1 through 3 in Nehemiah, and you see this kind of beautiful story starting. You see that he's the cupbearer of the king, and you see that God impresses upon him this desire to rebuild the wall, and he begins to pray and ask God for a door to open. 4 months later, we see that a door opens for him to talk to the king about the wall in Jerusalem. And so he talks to King Artaxerxes, and he takes a step. Goes out on faith here. And then what happens is King Artaxerxes is like, hey, Nehemiah, what's going on? And he says, hey, king, I need a break. I need like a 6-month vacation. I know that I've got a really important job, but I've got something to do in Jerusalem. And King Artaxerxes is like, okay. You can have 6 months off. I don't know about you, but I don't have a job that I could take 6 months off. And so 6 months, Nehemiah gets off. And then in the middle of that, he says, hey, king, I know you just granted me that, but can you give me a letter that says I can have as much wood as I need from your forest? And the king's like, yeah, sure, you can have that. Okay, great, thank you. But can I get something else too? I need passage to Jerusalem. And if I have a letter from you, I'll be able to walk through all the places and I'll have safe passage. And the king's like, yeah, great. And then he gets to Jerusalem. He starts getting people fired up about building the wall. He casts this vision for a city that's once again fortified with this wall. And then the people start building, right? They start building, all the gates start happening. You see in chapter 2, all these gates just start going on. And Nehemiah inspects the wall. He sees all that's going on. And then, chapter 3, they start rebuilding the wall. And then in the beginning of chapter 4, we see the time when his plans just don't go as they thought they would. Things seem to be tracking along really well. And then some enemies rise up. Sanballat, Tobiah. They're from a neighboring city, and they begin to think, they hear of Jerusalem's walls being fortified again, and they begin to think, hey, I'm going to take over that city. I'm going to take over. We're going to fight, and I'm going to create this uproar and this struggle. And so it's almost as if everything is tracking right, and then Nehemiah gets to a point where he's like, God, what is going on? And then we see here in 15 through 23, four things that Nehemiah and the people of Jerusalem do on the other side when their plans don't work out. And hopefully for us, it will be 4 things that we can do in our life when our plans don't work out, and 4 things we can do in our church when our plans don't work out. And so we see the first thing here, chapter 4, verse 15. Here's what it says. When our enemies heard that it was known to us that God frustrated their plan. Now take your pen if you're taking notes, and it's underlined, God had frustrated their plan. God had frustrated their plan. You see, Nehemiah had a plan. His plan gets kind of blown up by these enemies, and then now, on the other side of their enemies being defeated, it says here that God frustrated their plan. You see, that there are several things that Nehemiah could have done. There are several things that the people could have done. And the first is this. They could have just complained, right? God, are you serious? Like, we are tired. Like, we've been building this wall. We know that we've been building this wall in your city, the city that you've set up for us. And we're just exhausted. We're tired. And all we're trying to do is be faithful to what you've called us to. And can't you throw us a bone down here? We've been working so hard. We've been getting after it. And can't you just make our plans just work out? I don't know if you've ever complained like that. Or they could have just said this. Hey, you know what? Man, Sam Bout, Tobiah, dude, those guys right there, they were scared of us. I mean, they saw us, they saw our ability to fight, and Sam Bout, Tobiah, like those guys, they were just scared to confront us a little bit. And they could have bragged inside of their arrogance and gotten puffed up, right? Or they just simply said, hey, you know what? I don't know what happened, but God did something. Did they take any of the credit for the enemy's plans being spoiled? No. It was almost as if they saw the enemy and they saw the plans being spoiled, and they said, God is up to something right here. God is up to something. And so the first thing that we should do as people when our plans don't quite work out is we should understand that in the middle of the struggle, in the middle of the pain, in the middle of the situation when things aren't quite working out as we thought, the first thing we should recognize or have to recognize is that God is up to something. Is that God is up to something. My junior year in college, it was 2001, spring semester of my junior year. And my parents were coming down from Dallas, and they were coming because I was in the Easter pageant at church. And I was a townsperson, a Jewish dancer, and a Roman soldier. They had to be really proud of me during that moment. But I remember they came, and they watched this Easter pageant. So it was the end of April-ish. And they watch it, and then after the Easter pageant, we go to a restaurant that is no longer here in town. I can't remember the name, but they're known for their ice cream, and so we go and we eat ice cream. And in the middle of that conversation, that we start talking about our plans for the summer. And so my plan had always been to go to summer school, stay here in town, go to summer school so that I could graduate on time and kind of get out of school as fast as I could so I could head to seminary. And my parents' company wasn't quite doing as well as it had in the past. And so my parents came up to me and they said, hey, George, like, we know that you have a plan. And we know that you're about to register for summer school, but we just think that right now it would be best for you to find a job this summer, to find something else to help provide for you financially so that you can continue going to school. And I remember in that moment being pretty frustrated because my plan was to go to summer school, spend one more year at A&M, and be done. And I knew that, one, if I didn't go to summer school, that I would take another semester and I would have to spend some more time here, and my whole timing wasn't going to work out. But I also was frustrated that night because I just thought, you know what? If I knew I was going to get a job in January, then I would have looked for a job and I would have found a job. Now there's no jobs. The only jobs that are left are the ones that no one wants. And so I remember just being really frustrated that night, going to bed Saturday night, went to church on Sunday morning. Monday, went to the Baptist Student Ministry. I was leading worship there for the noon Bible study. Still frustrated. I told God how frustrated I was. We had a good, honest moment, and God was just like, hey, I understand. I hear you. But this is what you're doing. So I led worship, not in the right frame of mind, but I led worship, and we had the noon Bible study, and then right at the end, Bob Mayfield, the director of the BSM at the time, he said, hey, I just got a call this morning from a church in the Woodlands. Their youth pastor left, and they're looking for a couple guys with experience that will come and run their youth ministry for the summer. And it was almost as if God tapped me on the shoulder, and he's like, well, how about now, buddy? You got your plan figured out? So I go and I say, hey, Bob, I think this might be for me. I was the intern at my church, home church, the last 2 summers, and I have experience. I think this can work. And so 2 days later, I'm down at First Baptist Church in the Woodlands interviewing for this job, only to find out that 2 days after that, so 4 days later, 6 days after my parents tell me it's time for me to not go to summer school and find a job, I find myself accepting a job over the phone at a church in the Woodlands. You see, in the middle of my frustration, in the middle of my plans being blown up, God's like, hey, I'm just going to show off for you right now. And that's not where the story ends. It's funny because one of the parts of my job was to lead worship for the college Bible study. They were looking for youth stuff and then help with the college Bible study. And so on a Wednesday night, I went to the youth and then packed up my guitar and drove over to the house where the college Bible study was. And I open the door, walk up the stairs, and I see this beautiful, dirty, blonde-haired girl right in front of me. And I was like, oh, I wonder, what's her name? And so I get my guitar out and sing a song, and then the guy who's leading the study says, hey, let's just go around and introduce everyone. I know we're all kind of here, kind of gathered in the Woodlands again, and so let's go around. And so I'm kind of casually paying attention to everyone, and there's a Ginger, and there's a Jessica, and there's a few, a Grant, and a few others. But then when it came time to hear this girl's name, I kind of leaned forward in my chair, pretty interested in what was going on, and she says this, hi, my name is Lindsay Smith, and I go to the University of Texas. And I sit back in my chair. I was like, well, that was a good idea, but it's not going to work out between us two. And that whole summer, I began to get to know Lindsay, began to get to hear about her family. But it was ironic. Halfway through the summer, I learned why she was in the Woodlands. Her mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. And she was supposed to be in Austin for summer school, but in the middle of all the radiation treatments, in the middle of all the doctor's appointments, her mom forgot to pay the school bill. And there's a certain point that if you don't pay the school bill, you get dropped. And so what happened? She got dropped from classes. Because in the middle of that, her mom's plan blowing up caused her daughter to stay here, caused us to meet, and caused us to get married. So she got the best son-in-law because of that breast cancer. I'm just kidding. Sometimes she's like, oh man, And you know what? I don't know if you're like me, but oftentimes I forget in the middle of my struggle that God is doing something. I don't know if you're like that, but I have a tendency to be real short-sighted. I have a tendency to think, woe is me, God. Hey, God, where are you in the middle of this? And I have to continually remind myself and write things down. Hey, George, I just love it when God reminds me, hey, your family, I gave that. I did that for you. And I have to continually remind myself in the middle of my frustration that God is still at work. And so if there's one thing that we can hear continually, hey, in the middle of your struggle, in the middle of your frustration, in the middle of when life just messes up a little bit, God is intimately acquainted with your ways, the psalmist says. And he's moving in such a way to get you right where he wants you to be. So the first thing that we have to do in the middle of when our plans aren't working out is we have to recognize God is moving. But here's the second thing. We all return to the wall. In the middle of verse 15, we all return to the wall, each to his work. I love this. Not only did they recognize that God was moving, but they returned to the mission. They returned to the mission. If you were in charge of putting up a door at the sheep gate, then you went back to the sheep gate and you fulfilled your mission there. If you were the person that was carrying the material from the drop-off zone, then that's what you had to do. If you were the one nailing in boards in between the gates, then you were doing that. If you were the mason putting together stones and building up certain areas, then that's what you did. If your job was to put in windows or et cetera, weld steel doors together, then that was your job and that's what you did. Each one returned to his work. In other words, they held fast to the mission. You see, so often in the middle of our frustration or in the middle of our plans not working out, our first instinct is to quit what we're doing, right? Is to stop and go a different direction. But immediately, what these people do, they recognize that God is moving, and then they head right back to the mission that God has called them to. They go to the place that they last heard God speak, and they continued. And they continued. So often, perseverance has to come inside of our walk with the Lord. So often we have to remember, hey, God has called us to this even in the middle of our struggle, even in the middle of our pain. This is why I struggle so much with the prosperity gospel, because the idea is, hey, if you come to the Lord, then everything else is going to work out just right for you. But I don't see that anywhere in the scripture. I see the 12 disciples, the people that were closest to the Lord, and 11 of them, well, one betrays Jesus, and then 10 of them die by crucifixion, get killed for their faith. And the other one who didn't get crucified or who didn't get murdered for his faith, he just gets exiled to the island of Patmos. He got the easy one, tar and feathered, exiled to the island of Patmos. And I'm not saying that God never brings great things to us, but he does. But also the journey with the Lord, life is just hard sometimes. Life is difficult. And our job is to recognize God's moving and then stay firm to the mission that God has. I love that they just return right back to the wall. They just keep going. But what about the times when you feel like God is calling you somewhere else? Because God often uses struggles to move you in a different direction. The best way I know how to illustrate this is to say it like this, that you stay faithful to the mission that God has called you to until you feel the same feeling that God called you to in that original mission again. So my kids, Lindsay and I felt very, very confident and firm that our kids were to be in public school. Like growing up, we were in public school, and then, we started off our career. A lot of our friends send their kids to Brazos Christian, or they send their kids to Core, or they homeschool their kids. And can I just say this as a caveat? Like, every family has to decide what's best for their kids. And so whether it's public school, private school, or homeschool, like you have to. And so often we're really good at lobbing grenades at each other about which one's better. But every family has to make that choice for your kids. And so we made the choice. Hey, we feel like our kids for this stage are supposed to be in public school. We prayed about it. We spent a lot of times dialoguing about it. And I remember us feeling very strong, and then us going to dinner one night with some friends. And I remember us having conversations about school and Brazos Christian, and nothing was going terribly wrong at our kids' school. And then this family started talking about Brazos Christian, and I just kind of had a great dinner, and then Lindsay and I went home, and I didn't think anything about it for 3 days, but Lindsay, about 3 days later, came back to me and said, hey George, I just cannot shake this idea of Brazos Christian for our kids. Have you thought about it at all? I said, no, not even a little bit. I haven't even talked about it at all. Nothing. And it's ironic because Lindsay was by far the firmest in our kids going to public school. And so she oftentimes had to apologize to our friends because she would say harsh things about them, about Brazos Christian, or harsh things about other places. And she had to apologize. And so for her to say, hey, I can't shake this idea of Brazos Christian, was a clear movement of the Holy Spirit in her life. And so she's like, I think God's told me to go tour Brazos Christian. And I said, look, I know if we go tour that place, we're going to end up there. And she goes, I think I know. I said, well, do you know how much it costs? Because we've got 4 kids, and that's unbelievable. And she goes, no, I know, it's crazy. And so we go and we tour it. And in the middle of that tour, God just speaks to both of us and says, hey, it's time for this season for you. And so we stay the course. What the people did, what the Jewish people did in Jerusalem's time, when they were rebuilding the walls, they stayed the course. And I think for us, what it means is that we have to stay to the mission that God has for us until we hear God bringing in something else. Until in our time with the Lord that we hear God saying, hey, be committed to this mission now. So often, I've seen people in the middle of tough times just give up. But I think God shapes us the most in the perseverance. Shapes us the most in the perseverance. So the first thing they did was they recognized that God was moving. The second thing they did was they stuck to the mission. And look what they did third, verse 16. We're going to read till the end of verse 22. From that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, and half held the spears, the shields, the bows, and the coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah, who were building on the wall. Those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and held his weapon on the other. And each with the builders had his sword strapped to his side while he built. The man who sounded the trumpet was beside me, and I said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, the work is great and widely spread, and we are separated on the wall far from one another. In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. Underline that. Our God will fight for us. So we labored at the work, and half of them held the spears from the break of dawn until the stars came out. I also said to the people that at that time, let every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, that they may be a guard for us by night and may labor by day. So the first thing is they recognized that God was moving. The second thing is they stuck to the mission. The third thing is they made a plan. They made a plan. They knew that God had still called them to the mission, but they also knew that they would never fulfill the mission unless they made a plan. And so I love their plan. They said, hey, we all return to our work, and if you're carrying things, if you're bearing the burden of moving one thing, like the materials from one place to another, then we're going to load you up in such a way where you can grab onto those things and hold your weapon, just in case people come. And then second, if you're the one working, if you're the laborer, then you're going to fasten your weapon to your side and you're going to put it right here and you're going to labor and you're going to build stuff just in case people come. You'll have easy access to your weapon. Third, hey guys, this wall around the city is big. And so there's going to be trumpeters stationed all around the city. And so when you hear the trumpet blowing, you run to that area that's there. And when you come ready to fight. And know this, that when we fight, God's going to be fighting for us. That's the mentality we have going in. God's going to be fighting for us. And so I love it. So they labored at their work. Half of them held spears to the break of dawn. So half of them worked in the morning, half of them worked at night. Now, were they as efficient as they were before? No. Was it going as quickly as they wanted it to go? Probably not. Could they have been a lot quicker could they have gotten their job done faster if they just put their weapon aside and just began to do it? Yes. But they made a plan. They made a plan. And they followed that plan step by step. Can I tell you, growth comes from plans. Growth comes from making a plan. This wall is built because of a plan. My wife and I on Tuesday's a big day for us because we will just be finishing Whole 30. Now, if you don't know what Whole 30 is a diet. I see people's faces like, oh my gosh. Whole 30 is a diet where you eat no gluten, no sugar, no dairy. In other words, no fun. Like dinner is no fun. And so Tuesday is our last day of Whole 30. We'll jump on the scale, see how we did. And I hope it was worth it. I think it has been, but I hope it's worth it. But I'll tell you this. The only reason that we made it to Tuesday is because every Sunday night my wife would sit down and she would write Monday, breakfast, dinner, lunch. Tuesday, breakfast, lunch, dinner. Wednesday. And she made a plan all the way out. And we made a plan that what we're going to do when we get hungry. I've got these things called Lara bars at my office. They're like dates, cashews, and a cherry. I know, doesn't it sound awesome? Yeah, I've come to really like them, but man, it was terrible at first. And we made a plan at the middle of the night. Hey, we need something just to grab, just in case we're hungry. So we've gone through so many packages of air roasted salted cashews. So many, because that was our plan. And what allowed us to stick to it was the plan. So often, we recognize God's moving, we stick to the mission, and we never make a plan. Think about every New Year's. How many of us saying, you know what, this is the year that I'm going to read the Bible through. This is the year that I'm going to start spending time with the Lord. And we make this goal, but never make a plan to follow it. Well, these people, Nehemiah led them to make a plan. And then listen to what they did in verse 23. So neither I, nor my brothers, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us took off our clothes, and each kept his weapon right at his side. So the fourth thing they did is they committed themselves to the plan. They lived out the plan. Were they a little annoyed at times? Probably. Did they struggle at times? I'm sure. But they committed themselves to the plan that they came up with. And you know what they did? They took a step every day. They built another section of that wall every day. We were just fortunate enough to build a house, and I remember documenting the whole process. When they came in and they did all the dirt work, they brought all the select fill in, and then they ran the utilities, and then they dug out the beams and framed up the foundation, and then they did all of this stuff. They framed it real quick, and then they wrapped it with plywood, and then they wrapped it with some sheathing around, and then they started putting the windows in and all this stuff. And I remember going out there when they started doing the bricks. And what we got, a delivery, was, I don't know, a number of different stacks of bricks placed all around the house. And then they dumped a bunch of sand. And they dumped a bunch of other things to mix mortar on our lot. So I remember going there when the brickers started, and I saw one guy just mixing up the mortar. I saw another guy over there by the wall, moving bricks to where they needed to go. I saw another guy delivering the mortar to where it needed to go. And they would just one by one put the brick up and work in sections. And then I remember just thinking, this is painstaking work. I mean, how long is this going to take? And then when it got up to about this high, they built framing kind of all around our house. And then they had one guy come in and drop bricks all around, and then drop mortar all around. And the one guy would just slap the mortar on the brick and put it down. And you know what they did? They just kept going. Brick by brick, row by row, section by section. And when that section was finished, they took the scaffolding, moved it to another place, and they went brick by brick, row by row, section by section. One at a time. And you know what happened? They finished. They finished. Sometimes being committed to the plan just means taking one small step every day. Sometimes being committed means that today, God, I really wanted to take a leap, but you know what? Today I'm just going to trust you a little bit more. Sometimes, God, today I don't really feel like doing what I've committed I was going to do, but I'm going to take one small step and I'm going to keep going. Day by day, really minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day. And when you look back, you'll see I took a bunch of steps. How does someone run the marathon of life? One step at a time. One step at a time. So the four things that Nehemiah led his people to do. One, recognize that God was still moving. The second thing was they fulfilled the mission. They kept to the mission. The third thing was they made a plan. And the fourth thing is they committed to it. Now, about 10 years ago, I found myself in a similar situation as Living Hope does right now. The pastor of the church that I was serving at, which was my home church, had been there for 27 years. And I remember this day, like our worship pastor was gone this day, so I led worship, and I remember our pastor getting up and resigning. Was there 27 years. He was the guy that he was the second pastor, but really the first full-time pastor, and he took the church from 25 to 30 to 500 over that 27-year period. And I remember like the day that he announced his resignation, everyone just kind of thought, okay, well, like, what are we going to do now? Like, what's happening now? And so we walked through that month that he was still there. And I remember we made a bunch of plans. We started the pastor search committee. We divvied up all the pastors' roles to the staff. And then we hired someone that was going to teach for us every week. But he was going to start a little later. And so they got a team together. And I remember that last week we kind of had a bunch of goodbyes. And so we moved on, and we all were just kind of shell-shocked because that last day we had this big reception for him, saying goodbye to him, and we were just not annoyed or not frustrated or upset at him, but just a little anxious because we thought Brother Bob was going to be there forever. It's all we had known for 27 years. He had built millions of dollars of buildings. And we all thought that he was going to baptize our kids, and because he baptized us, and that he was going to marry our kids, and you keep going down the line. And so here I am as a youth pastor, and the team that was in charge of getting the pulpit supply in the interim period, they said, "Hey George, we can't find anybody for the first 4 weeks. Will you speak?" 26 years old. Standing up in front of a church who had the same pastor for 27 years. And I remember that week, like, what do I say to a church that is looking for direction now? And I remember going to Acts chapter 2 and just looking at the early church, asking the question, hey, what do we do now? And ironically, it's the same thing that we see right here in Nehemiah. We recognize that God is up to something. Hey, God's doing something in our midst right here. The second thing is we stick to the mission. We stick to the mission. We're still the church, and we stick to it. The third thing is that we come up with a plan. And I've spent enough time with the CAT team knowing that, hey, there's a plan in place. And it's moving. Is it going as fast as they want it to go? Probably not. Maybe it is. And then fourth, we stick to that plan. And so if I could just encourage all of us in our personal lives and as a body of believers, that we do the same thing that Nehemiah is right here. I was preparing this week, and I just thought, how great is God? My first Sunday here as interim pastor is a lesson on how to handle our lives when our plans don't go as we thought. Can we see that God is doing something? Man, let's make a plan, and let's stick to it day by day. Feel good about it?